now use the rotate up keyframes to rotate from no transform to -4 degrees. Introducing the titles. So far, we've set the scene for our animated landing page with the background image. We've seen how to add and animate pseudo elements, and even delved into custom timing functions. Let's take that further. In this lesson, we'll animate in the content on top and take the opportunity to experiment with more bouncy timing functions, animation choreography, and creating reusable sets of keyframes. To continue from the previous lesson, open the sample code zip file and look for the folder 01 animated background. A completed version of this lesson's code is in the folder 02 introduced titles. Like in the choreography you see in stage performances and dances, we're going to think about how all the various pieces of content in our hero header move together. We could have the elements slide into place like the background image, which would show a nice connectedness between the elements. Let's also take it further by making each of the elements seem to pop out of the screen. To begin, we'll create some keyframes for the animation. Within a keyframes container, we want 0% and 100% frames, representing the beginning and end states of the animation. Initially, the content will be invisible, so we're setting opacity to 0. To mirror the movement of the background, we'll also use a transform to translate the position of the content up. Lastly, we're adding a new transform. We're scaling the size down to 0.8 in the starting frame. This means that when the animation starts, the elements will be a little smaller, and by the end, they will have animated to their normal size. We can now apply these keyframes to our content. However, rather than adding an animation property to each element one at a time, let's take this opportunity to set up a reusable class for the animation. If we create a new class called animate pop-in, we can then have this apply the animation more efficiently. To get started, in our HTML, we add this class to each of the content items we want to animate. We've added the animate pop-in class to the image, the headings, and the paragraph text. Now we can make use of that in our CSS. Here's what we add to our CSS. We begin with the class animated pop-in and the animation with the name pop-in, a duration of 0.6 seconds, the ease out timing function, and the animation fill mode of forwards. Here's how it looks. It's a start, but we can do better. Currently, the content elements are popping in while the page is still blank. When we built our background animation, we made use of the animation delay property. This meant the background waited for 0.5 seconds before the animation began. Let's add some delays to our content items so that they show up after the background has started to appear. Before we start adding delays, we set out which elements we're going to style. We have the Rocky dashed item, the header title, the header subtitle, and lastly the header button. These 4 elements will need to appear one at a time. Thankfully, we don't need to put the entire animation property for each one, as these elements already have the animate pop-in class. We'll just specify a delay for each one. Since the background animation takes about a second to get going, let's start these off with a delay of 1 second and increase it for each element. We'll also need to set these elements to be invisible on load. To avoid the flash where they're visible, then they animate in after a delay. Set the opacity on the animate pop in element. So let's see the result. We've added a delay that starts at 1 second, then each item waits a further 0.2 seconds before starting. When we look at the result, we see the animations staggered. Now, it might just be my opinion here, but I reckon these seem to be appearing just a little bit late. Let's go back through and change the numbers so they start at 0.6 seconds instead. On second thoughts, let's make that last item, the header button, appear a little more closely with just a 0.1 second gap. That's better. It's a good idea to take time to tweak things like animation delays and timing functions by eye. Sometimes an animation won't feel right, and it might just be a question of messing around with the timings until it all works together. So, now we have a staggered animation. It's looking pretty good, but the way the animation ends feels a little flat. Let's see if we can bring some life to this little animation with a more bouncy timing function. It's time to replace that old ease out timing function with something more interesting. Over on cubicbezier.com, we'll create a curve that starts fast but then shoots right past the top and settles back to the finishing point. Place the first point on the left axis near the top to give it that fast start, then the second point above the top line. The resulting curve should be a long, steep arc that tapers back at the end. Taking the coordinates and putting them into our animation property now looks like this. We have a cubic Bezier with coordinates 0, 0.9, 0.3 and 1.2. Let's see how that looks. It's starting to look a lot better now. The purpose of this choreography is to not only look cool, but to draw attention to what we want our visitors to see. In this case, it's straightforward. We want people to see the title, and then they have their attention drawn to the big call to action button in the middle. There's a second goal here though, and that's to let people know that there's more content further down the page. We're going to help draw attention to that using a chevron at the bottom of the page, but we can add a subtle animation to the header also. Let's try our hand at a rotate transform by animating that big white wedge at the bottom of the screen. As before, we'll create the keyframes for this new animation. We begin with the keyframes, the title, rotate up, and inside 100%, and a transform with rotate Z -4 degrees. You'll notice there's no 0% this time. That's because it's optional. You can choose to leave out either the starting or even the ending keyframe, and the browser will infer it based on the styles given to the element. In this case, it'll go from having no transform to being rotated. We apply this by making a couple of changes to our header after block. First, we add the animation property, giving it the animation name of rotate up. I've decided to make the duration just 0.5 seconds this time. If it's longer, it'll still be moving when the other content is appearing, and that could confuse the flow. We'd like this to be a subtle animation that doesn't distract from the main content. We'll have it delayed for 0.5 seconds and use the same timing function as the background image. Lastly, we want this to begin without any transform, so we remove that line. It should now use the rotate up keyframes to rotate from no transform to -4 degrees. In this lesson, we have learned how to create and apply an animation to a class of elements, then use the animation delay property to choreograph them. We'll be able to reuse this animate pop-in class elsewhere without adding any extra CSS code to our project, essentially making it the beginning of our own animation library. Next up, we'll delve into the art of combining multiple animations by introducing a scroll queue.